Hi, welcome back to the our next section on the multifacetedness of vulnerability, some different dimension and context. Basically, many diverse definitions and interpretation of vulnerabilities existing in the disaster risk reduction as well as climate change adaptation literature, and which then ultimately has led to you can call it Babylonian confusion, in which so many definitions are existing with little understanding behind it. So there are numerous dimensions or numerous, you can say, relationships and causes and dependencies of vulnerability, which have been tried to be explained through different models. But despite the existence of these models for vulnerability assessment, which have been evolving over time, there has no consensus achieved that which dimension effectively explains the concept of vulnerability. So, in disaster risk science and climate change adaptation, vulnerabilities increasingly acknowledged to be a very human-induced phenomena, and it has been identified as a root cause of severe disaster impacts. So, the operational definition might vary between UNDRR or the IPCC, but vulnerability has been uh, viewed through different contexts, dimensions, and scales. And there has been no universal theory or model which has been made to explain the multifacetedness of the concept of vulnerability. Uh, now, eh, moving on, let's talk about some different characteristics of vulnerability, some different context. So, how are we going to be measuring vulnerability? Are we going to be measuring only the physical aspect of vulnerability, which might incorporate your structures, buildings, engineering aspect of, uh, like for example, some built environment that might be physical. Then we talk about social. Is the society ready enough to tackle a disaster? How much vulnerable they are? What are the conditions existing in today's society which makes it very much vulnerable? What are the current economic and financial mechanism existing in an area which makes it vulnerable, more vulnerable or less vulnerable? Where is that city or in that area or settlement located? How environmentally exposed it is? Is it near riverbank? How and are we going to be polluting this? Are we going to be choking that kind of canal that might result in flooding? How much are institutions ready for it? How much vulnerable they are? How much capacities they have that they can tackle a disaster? So that defines kind of vulnerability. One aspect is this, that is we call it contextual or dimensions of vulnerability. Then we talked about dynamic. If you're going to be assessing a vulnerability in a particular area, it will change over time. So the spatial and temporal scales. Spatial, how at which unit of scale are you going to be measuring it? Are we going to be measuring how at household level, individual level, household level, village level, let's say sub-district level, district level, city level, metropolitan level, regional level? So different scales are existing. And at what particular time are you going to be measuring it? So over time, that scale will change. The vulnerability values of vulnerability or the let's say severity of the vulnerability, susceptibilities or capacity, it will change. So vulnerability being a dynamic phenomena, it will change over time. So again, I usually use the word evolving phenomena. So it all the vulnerability depends on the site, some condition, the scale, time, as well as the dimension. So we must know what kind or what aspect of vulnerability are we targeting, which problems we are going to be analyzing it so that we can prepare appropriate disaster risk reduction measures. So depending on the scales of the sectors or the components, like environmental, economic, functional, physical, as well as different scales, as well as different sectors. So contextual factors, that are we talking only about infrastructure? Are we focusing on health, medical emergencies? Are we talking about agriculture? Are we going to be developing or assessing the vulnerabilities of agriculture sector, the crops, the yield, this livestock safety? Or are we going to be working on some kind of critical infrastructure? Are we going to be saving those kind of dams, bridges? uh, power plants, or are we going to be developing some kind of financial mechanism to cope up with the disaster, to uh, give assistance to the affected communities to recover better or build back better? So this, depending on the different sectors, your type of vulnerability will vary. And ultimately, that vulnerability, if you're going to be monitoring some kind of contextual vulnerability, some kind of component of vulnerability, and on a particular scale, that would ultimately also result in the risk factor, because risk is the overall holistic terminology. So vulnerability is a core component of risk assessment. So we have identified that it is a dynamic, a multifaceted, and a various multidimensional phenomena. So we have to be considering all of these to have a very solid or robust kind of vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability as a multi-dimensional construct, it's not very easy to capture. So there are so many unknown issues uh, or conditions in the society which makes our citizens or our people very much vulnerable. So over time, some disaster we might let's say overlook some issues, and that might result in a vulnerability or a disaster. So ultimately, the governments must try to keep up with the vulnerabilities, keep on identifying the vulnerabilities, and keep on updating their own disaster management plans to better understand the vulnerabilities. And when they understand when they understand vulnerabilities, then they will react appropriately, or they can respond effectively, or they can like prepare effectively. Now, vulnerability is a very again this vulnerabilities often overlap with the terminologies of adaptation, capacities, and resilience. So vulnerability is also a cross-cutting theme into different terminologies as well. So it has emerged as one of the word which is going to be which is comprehensively being used in disaster risk science and climate change, and like overall, if we combine disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation phenomena, we call it global environmental change. So vulnerability has emerged as a key component or key phenomena to understand the global environmental change which is happening all over the world. So depending on the scale, as we've talked about it, your scale, that scale will change your perspective on how we are going to be analyzing your vulnerability. Thank you.